Ladies and gentlemen, from the depths of the sweltering, fetid, and humid heartland of America, the Kansas City on the other side of the mighty Mo, welcome to Hittin the Bricks with Kathleen, the do-it-yourself genealogy podcast with your questions and her answers. I am John, your humble hubby host, and today we have a very special discussion about the Forgotten Children Initiative. You're not going to want to miss this one, but there's a lot to cover, so let's start hitting the bricks. Okay, we are here with Mark Schindler, Rebba Omer, and Daniel Feldman, and of course the brick hitter, Kathleen Brandt. And we're going to talk about forgotten children.
I call this Forgotten Children Initiative. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's the initiative that we have initiated out of Georgetown University's Center for Youth Justice in Washington. So the work in Missouri, I think, is coming off of that. So I think it's fine to refer to it as Forgotten Children.
Mark, could you tell us a little bit about you and how you got involved? And
yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, John, and thanks for having me. So I'm an attorney by training, but I've done a number of different things in addition to lawyering during my career, primarily representing children in juvenile justice and child welfare systems. That includes serving as a public defender for a period of time, like Daniel does in Missouri. I did that in Baltimore many years ago. I've worked as an advocate on policy and research, as well as litigation on behalf of children in juvenile justice and child welfare systems. And I've had 2 stints in government, helping to lead juvenile justice agencies in Washington, D.C. from 2005 to 2010, and most recently in Maryland from 2023 to the middle of 2025. And it was during my stint in Maryland, when I was helping to lead Department of Juvenile Services, that we came upon the issues that we're going to be discussing today related to forgotten children.
oh, thanks so much. And also thanks for the work that you do on behalf of people who often need an additional voice to back them up. And Rebba, can you do the same?
Absolutely. So my name is Rebba Omer. I work for the Georgetown Law School's Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. I am the senior staff attorney and lead program manager there. I do research and writing and help create and execute trainings for youth defenders and other systems actors in the juvenile legal system. I've been at Georgetown 8 years now, and before that, I also was a public defender. I was in Knoxville, Tennessee, representing kids there.
And how's the weather in Georgetown today?
Well, so I actually live in Missouri, so that is how I am connected to this. So even though Mark and I both work for Georgetown, I work remotely. I've worked remotely since 2020. Okay. Yeah, and so this is really a personal project for me in many ways, coming out of the fact that I live in Missouri. I'm raising a child here. I'm married to a public defender who will introduce himself in a moment, but I care deeply about what's happening with children in Missouri. And so this is a personal as well as professional passion of mine.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks for the work you do. Daniel, thanks for being so patient while I figured out where everybody was.
I'm Daniel Feldman, and I am with the Public Defender's Office. I'm the district defender, so the supervisor of our children's defense team here in Columbia, Missouri. We represent young people charged with delinquency offenses, and then if they are certified as adults in adult court, sort of throughout central Missouri for the public defender system here. I think I have to note off the top, John, that I'm not speaking today on behalf of the Missouri State Public Defender, but in my personal capacity. More importantly, I am living here in Columbia, married to Rebba, and raising the same toddler she is.
Oh, okay.
So we're honored to be doing this work here in Missouri specifically.
So I have a question for both Rebba and Daniel. Did you get connected to this program through Mark, or was that a happenstance?
Yeah, great question. I heard about it through the Georgetown Network. So I know I work for Professor Chris Henning at Georgetown. Georgetown, and she and Mark's office have done a lot of projects and trainings together through the years, and she's the one that forwarded me the email about their sort of launch webinar, and it immediately made me wonder, what's happening in Missouri, or what happened here in the place that I now call home. So really it is through Mark.
And I will note, Kathleen, that I heard about it from Rebba, and it feels particularly prescient too, because I'm currently representing young people in Missouri here in Columbia, near Boonville, which we're going to talk about. And so it feels particularly sort of relevant to the work we're doing right now.
These types of projects are popping up all over the United States. And I get lots of calls and messages on them. Like, what do we do next? How do we find this out? And it's not just for young kids' homes. It's all institutions. So whether it's a prison, where it's an asylum of some sort. And we find that there's always the same issue. And that is, how do we identify family? Where are the records? And what other things would you all add to that?
I think it's a great question, Kathleen. When we started this work, it really comes out of an experience while I was working at Maryland's Department of Juvenile Services just a few years ago. When I started there in 2023, we initiated a research project about the history of the agency's facilities and the juvenile justice system in Maryland generally. And we were interested in doing that because when we were doing advocacy 25 years ago, when we were working for nonprofits and trying to push for better conditions for kids, including in Maryland, we were focused on one facility in particular back then in the early 2000s. And that was the Cheltenham Youth Detention Center out in Prince George's County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And when we were doing that advocacy, we learned that back in the day, that facility was originally called the House of Reformation for Colored Children. And that name just stuck with me, that it was a segregated facility. Didn't surprise me, but it did stick with me. Fast forward 20 plus years, when my colleague Vinnie Schiraldi and I were now running that agency, we talked about it, and I said, I think we should research the segregated history of the facilities and the system. And so we started to do that. And we started to learn lots of information. We had a terrific staff member named Crystal Ferretia who was doing the research. It was about a year into that research when we, quite frankly, stumbled upon that years before, many, many years before, children had died out of that facility and were buried across the road. We had no idea that that happened. And so at that point, we started to look into it and to try to figure out what had happened. And that's what led to discovering, tragically, graves of what we were told was 4 to 5 children who were buried out in the woods. But what we discovered was probably somewhere between 200 and 300 Black boys who were buried between the years about 1870 to 1940. And this is while we were still at the department, and we started to think about what we should do. I will say our first thing on the list was not to do genealogical research. That was included in the things we thought about doing, but we didn't have experience in that. But we started to think about and talk to people around the country about doing an investigation to try to figure out how many children were buried.
So, Rebba, is that how you found out about the project there? And how did you land in Missouri finding a reform school also?
Yeah, so I went to the launch webinar of the Georgetown Forgotten Children Initiative, like Mark is talking about, and I was so moved by learning some of the stories of the boys and hearing from family members that Mark and his team had connected with. Seeing how they were connecting this to advocacy for children in the juvenile legal system today. And the whole project I found, incredibly moving and important, and it made me immediately wonder about Missouri. And I just knew, there must have been, right, these reform schools, as they were called at the time, and I think are fairly referred to as youth prisons now, right? There must have been places like this in Missouri. And so I just started Googling and quickly found that about 25 minutes from where I live in Columbia, there was in Boonville, Missouri, what was called the Missouri Training School for Boys. It had a few different names through its almost 100-year history. And then quickly found from there that there similarly is a burial ground, a forgotten cemetery where some of the young people who died when they were incarcerated are buried. And from what I found on findagrave.com, people had been out to this cemetery and had done some preliminary research on who was buried there, and just quickly kind of started taking notes on all of this, and ultimately found 27 death certificates of boys who are buried on this plot of ground. And people think that there's probably at least 50 boys actually buried there. There could be even more, we're not sure, but it was just a quick sort of internet search, and then it just made it feel, even closer to home.
Kathleen, I'm trying to tie this to, would this fall in the time frame of orphan trains and things like that?
I don't know. What time frame are we talking here?
So in Missouri, the youth prison in Boonville, the training school for boys, opened in 1889, and then it closed in, I want to say 1984.
So, Josh, this is a lot more recent. So, Daniel, what is your role in this?
Well, I think that there is a connection between how we have treated children in the past in Missouri and how we treat children today in Missouri. Missouri's legal system has wrestled as early as like the 19th century, what we're talking here, with how to treat our vulnerable children. And so I really do believe that how we treated children in Boonville, not far from here, in the 19th and the 20th century, not that long ago, is really important in terms of the context of how we're treating our most vulnerable children involved in our systems today. I will also say, first and foremost, Kathleen, I'm making this connection to the current day. It's my job working with children now. First and foremost, though, the children who were sent to Boonville, who died there, deserve to be remembered by us as Missourians. So I think that's an important place for us to start. Is we live here, we are citizens of Missouri, and so yes, I could go off on a tangent about our system, and I'm excited to talk about our systems, how they've improved and where we have room to grow. But we need to remember the children who lived and died at Boonville. Ultimately, we're responsible for how we treat our children, and it includes those in our past.
So the Boonville project that you all are working on, what stage are you in, and what are you doing, and how did you all happen to become genealogists?
Are they all I'm assuming that nobody here except for Kathleen is a genealogist.
That would be correct.
We're lawyers.
So please tell her how we all became genealogists.
Yeah, I would not claim the title of genealogist. Maybe someday I can say I'm an amateur genealogist, but not even that today. We are in the early stages, but we do have a small team formed already to move the project forward. We've gotten a lot of interest from people who are interested in, like Daniel was saying, protecting the rights of children today and remembering and honoring these children who died in the past here in our home in Missouri. And so we've been meeting pretty regularly to learn more, share information with each other as we learn about the history of Boonville. We have been, strategizing about how to move the project forward in terms of genealogical research. That our goal, like Mark was saying, really is to connect with living family members, living descendants of these boys, so that then they can help inform our process for what it looks like to remember. What does it look like to honor these children? We really think that having the voices of the family members is critical. And so that's where, in part, we're here to invite the community members of the podcast to consider whether they might be interested in joining us and volunteering and offering their genealogical skills to help us begin to identify identify these people.
Mark mentioned that the one he worked on in Maryland was a colored boys historically. Is that makeup the same, the demographics the same in Boonville?
Yeah, great question. It's different, but I do think that the racial disparities that existed in Boonville are a huge part of the story and a huge part of what we can learn and what we can consider about how we should change today. So Boonville, it had both African American and white youth. The total number of youth varied between about 400 to almost 700 at different points during the history of the facility. And there was a racial disparity in terms of comparing to the general population of Missouri, right, at the time. So from my sort of quick research into this, the African American population of Missouri has varied from about 5% in 1910 to then like 10, 11% in the late 80s, early 90s when Boonville closed. And from what I've seen in the 27 death certificates that we have, about 40% of the boys buried that we have records of from those death certificates at least are African American. So that is a huge disparity, right, when we're thinking in terms of comparison to the general population. And then also in historical research, reading about what conditions were like at Boonville throughout its history, the African American boys were segregated into a separate house, a barrack. It was a military style academy for most of its history. There were reports throughout the history about how African American boys did not have the same access to vocational programs or educational services. They didn't have the same access to like the dining hall as the other boys. They had to eat in a separate space. It seems very apparent that they were having a different experience, and conditions were horrible for everyone. So, I can only imagine how much worse it must have been to be an African American child in this facility.
What would be your go-to record when, let's say, you're taking a particular circumstance, a particular child, and you were, for whatever reason, needed more information on that child? Where do you guys go first? What's your thing like, okay, I know I'm 90% likely to get a hit on this if I go and tell me where it is your first stop is when you're starting to do your research?
Most of these facilities, when they were actually established to remove children from adult jails and prisons, right? That's why they were first established. And that's a issue that people are wrestling with from a policy matter in Missouri today, most recently in Maryland and other places. So I think that context is important. To your question, John, about what we look at, first of all, again, we didn't know we were going to be finding kids who had died in these facilities and were buried nearby. So we weren't looking for the children at first. But when we did, we wanted to figure out what we should do. And so we started talking to people in Florida, because that was the only other place that we were familiar with in a juvenile justice context of a similar discovery. And they started to guide us. Dr. Aaron Kimmerly of Florida, who's a professor there at the University of South Florida, started to guide us, and we started to put plans together. We then, for various reasons, left state government, and so I started doing this on my own. For folks, I think your listeners are probably familiar with Georgetown's history of the sale of enslaved people and the genealogical work that was done to discover those descendants of what is known as the GU 272. When I was thinking about going to Georgetown, I started talking to some of those people. And that's where the work started, to try to find the families and to look at the records. And so that's when we started doing the genealogical work and looking at the records, particularly initially the death certificates. So John, you asked the go-to. If we can get a death certificate, that's the initial most important document to find. And in Maryland, we were able to find 128 death certificates. I then handed those to our genealogist, and she then went to work.
So let me ask this question, and it's hypothetical. I'm a descendant, looking for an ancestor who disappeared in 1869, 1870. And I'm saying those years because of the Civil War, right? So somewhere shortly after the Civil War, I noticed that a person has disappeared from a census record, let's say the 1870 census record, that might have been in some other written record. In that case, as a descendant, how would you tie your goal to that descendant?
That's a great question. First, I want to say anything I talk about here, I've been educated by Melissa Ruffner, who's the genealogist who is working on behalf of the Forgotten Children Initiative, and who was one of the lead genealogists who worked with the Georgetown Remembrance Project. A couple of things, and I think this is probably important for your audience, and I'm just learning these things. They didn't have descendants. Almost all of these children died.
Let's say it's my great uncle who died.
Yes.
So I'm doing research, and of course, for me, doing research for a family, I'm doing an entire family. I do a cluster. I don't just go straight up a line. I do all the siblings, first cousins, second cousins, third cousins. We get DNA up to about fifth cousins. So are you working with DNA at all?
Not yet, but I think that will likely happen in Maryland. In Maryland, there's now been a statutorily created commission called the Commission on the House of Reformation for Colored Children that's been established. There are 3 family members who have been appointed as members of that commission, and they will be taking up the question of the forensic investigation that could and should take place, including DNA analysis, including exhuming of graves. All those things, I think, will be considered. And we already have a pathologist, a forensic pathologist, who is volunteering his time, Dr. Roger Mitchell, who is advising families on those processes and what could potentially happen.
Rebba, I'm going back to this Missouri project, and that this is in what we call the Black Belt, right? Boonville was part of the Black Belt, even though it was on the edge, because we had slavery all up and down the Missouri, Mississippi. So if we are talking about that, what would you want to do in the end with this information?
Great question. I do really believe in the importance of involving the living family members in guiding that process. I think, Mark has at some point in the past described this as a restorative justice project in a way, right? That this is about reparations in some way, right? It's about making things right as close as possible, with the understanding that there's nothing that can, create the opportunity for these boys to come back to life and live their full lives as they should have and have direct descendants, like Mark is saying, right? That is a tragedy that's irreparable, but that the family members could guide a process honoring them and seeking this sort of restorative justice. I think, some, outcomes that we've talked about that could be possible could, be things like a remembrance ceremony, grave markers. It sounds like there's a lot of unmarked graves. This, to be very clear, the cemetery is on Department of Corrections property. There are no trespassing signs, kind of all around where we know it to be. And there's a grove of trees around it. You can't access it right now, so without permission from the Department of Corrections. Which also means, that the people, even if you knew that your, great uncle was buried there, you would not be able to just walk in. You would have to seek permission from the Department of Corrections. And across the street, there actually is a cemetery that's beautifully kept that presumably, other people who lived in Boonville throughout the years are buried there. It's just a very stark contrast. I think, some other things like, Mark is talking about a state commission to explore all of this seems like it could be very important in Missouri as well. Like I said, we don't know how many people are buried there. I think that's going to require more resources and I think cooperation at some point, right, from the Department of Corrections, since it's on their grounds. I think the family members, if they're interested, could be involved in testifying about current issues happening in the youth justice system today. Like Mark has said and Daniel has described, we are where we are today in part because of the policies of the past and the way these children were treated in the past. I think it's also important to say that I'm sure many people who were involved in creating and implementing the policies that created this place of horrors for these children, I'm sure there were many people who were well-intentioned or who thought that they were doing the best thing for kids or for society. And that, to me, should give us all pause today, right? That we can think that we are doing the best thing for children when actually we might be causing harm that reverberates for generations. I also think when we're talking about racial disparities, this is like looping back a little bit, right? And talking about today, I always feel like it's very important to say that there are these huge disparities between African American youth and white youth in our juvenile legal system throughout the country today. And we also now have, I think, about 40 years of data. They call it self-report data on behavior of youth. So kids are filling out these surveys about, are they using drugs? Are they stealing things? Are they carrying weapons? And that data shows us that these disparities in our juvenile legal system are not justified by differences in youth behavior, that actually the way kids behave is really similar across race. So the white kids and the African American kids they're all behaving like kids. They're all doing these things that we as adults would prefer they didn't do at very similar rates. So I just think that's important to say. We don't have that data going back to the 1910s. It's more recent, but just what we know about how kids are, I think we can safely say the same was true back then, and yet the disparities are there. So I think, like I said, I think there's so much that we can and should learn from the past.
What are the numbers of immigrants that you all are seeing in your records or databases or whatever you have gathered?
So I'll speak just briefly for Missouri that we are not far enough along to really answer that question accurately. From the 27 death certificates that I have, there's 11 African American, I believe 3 where no race is listed, and then 1 Alaskan Native. And then the rest are white. So when I've also been kind of starting to look through these annual reports that the state agency in charge of the facility, issued every year. And there's more information there on the youth who are incarcerated, and it lists out the different countries of origin or immigrant groups like you're talking about, Kathleen. So that's something that we could continue to look into in the future.
John, do you have other questions? Because I wanted to make sure that those who are genealogists and they're looking for their missing ancestors are covered. But the background is so interesting on how to get there.
If you're looking into kind of the reform school in any place, in any circumstance, and especially if you're looking from African American and probably immigrant side, the assumption that they would be in a juvenile home might be your first mistake. That they're actually in an adult prison as opposed to any sort of juvenile home.
I think that's a good point.
What kind of records beside death certificates are you all actually finding? And Rebba, you mentioned that you're reading the reports, but do they mention the children by name individually in those?
That's a great question. They don't. Not that I have seen. There's listed numbers of each year of kids who escaped, kids who died, kids who were paroled. I also have found at the State Historical Society here in Columbia, they have a collection of newspapers that were printed at Boonville, and sections of them at least were written by the boys themselves. There are these updates on what's happening at the facility. They don't have them for every year that the facility was open, but a number of years. And I've found records of deaths and funerals and burials that happened on site in those, and that has led me to few additional that I need to, research and find the death certificates for. But that, I think, could be another resource for people to look into if they're curious. What I have found is that those are not digitized in Missouri. So you can't just do a Control F and, search for the name of the person. I've been going there and sitting there and leafing through and looking for these things. So it's not the most efficient way to do it, and you might not find anything at all. There's many boys who I have records of their death from the death certificates who are not mentioned in the newspaper as well.
If I could just add to that, and the three of us are lawyers. I'm a lawyer who's learned a lot about genealogical research over the past year. As I understand, more typically, what happens these days is somebody is trying to research and find their ancestors. This is different, largely.
We call that forensic genealogy. That is a different approach. I used to have to do that for adoption cases, people who wanted to know where their family was. So it is different. That research is different. And thank you for reminding our listeners that forensic genealogy is something that we train on throughout the genealogical community.
I always go back to a lot of times the one-place studies, and I don't know if our guests are familiar with that, which is sometimes a cluster research where somebody will take a place, and instead of searching an individual, then they really are documenting the time and space and all the individuals and all the happenings of that particular place. And in a lot of ways, this kind of feeds into that. You're building from that time to the present as opposed to researching back to it.
That's correct.
Yeah, so your forensic genealogy, Kathleen, would come into heavy play even with those one-place studies or one-name studies.
I think that's a very helpful way to think about it. And what we're doing, the place, if you will, is that youth correctional placement, whether it's called a reform school, a house of refuge, or house of reformation. So going through those records. In Maryland, for example, we looked in the state archives, just the way Rebba's describing, at the annual reports. We have learned that nearly 300 children died, and a lot of those are documented in those annual reports, but only 7 names of the nearly 300 were listed. Otherwise, they were just listed as numbers. Many of the families that we are working with in Maryland didn't know that this family member even existed. Some had information, some knew that there was a child in their family that had died, but many didn't. So we think it's important. They have a right to know. And then, as Rebba was saying, it's really their right to determine what happens.
Daniel?
Well, I just wanted to add to what Mark was saying, that what we're really talking about is how we treat children, and we have examples. The reason why this genealogy here is so important, in my mind, we don't have all the names. The names are not in those annual reports that we're talking about in Maryland, whether it's Maryland or New York or Missouri. And so the question was and continues to be is, how do we want our children to be treated? How do we want them to be documented? And I really think that we should all care what happened. If you're in Missouri, you should care what happened in Boonville, because that's a reflection on all of us, right? Just as citizens. If you're in New York, you should care what happened at a reform school in New York. And I will just mention about these efforts. Currently, the research shows that community-based rehabilitative approaches are less expensive and more effective for young people. We represent young people who, in some cases, have caused harm. And so what we're talking about is the harm caused by young people sometimes, and then the harm done to young people in these facilities. And the work that's being done shows us that we can have our young people integrated into our communities in positive ways through these juvenile courts and through these reforms. And so I think that we should all care what happened there so that we can do better now. And also to, as Mark said, help the families of those young people to honor their families in the way that they wish.
Guests, do you have anything that you'd like to make sure that everybody knows about, or any upcoming events, anything that anybody should be keying into legislation pending or anything like that you want people's antennas up for?
I'll just, end by, saying thank you, Kathleen and John, for hosting us and this important conversation. As I said, we are really at a critical moment of stepping into searching for the living family members of the young people who died and were buried at Boonville. And if anyone is interested in joining our efforts and volunteering their expertise in genealogy, we would be incredibly grateful to have you as part of our team here in Missouri. I will make sure that Kathleen has my email address to put in the show notes if anyone would like to reach out.
Fantastic.
I'm just sort of in awe of the work y'all are doing and have done, and really seeing for the first time the importance of this work. So thank you to all the listeners who are involved in this, and to Kathleen and John, to you, Kathleen, to you. And of course, we would love to work with somebody, but it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having us. Thank you for having me. And it's really wonderful learning about your universe a little bit.
John would wish it was not his part of his universe, but that's okay, Daniel. Thank you.
I love my many universes that I pass in between.
And Mark, thanks for sharing with us your Georgetown experience, because that sounds like the start of it all, the kind of the model that people are using is how you did it. Yeah. But there is a group called the African American Genealogical Historical Society, AUGS, and right now they're doing a conference, online conference. That is another connection that each of you all should reach out to. I do not want to leave out the immigrants, but unfortunately it's inside the reform, inside these reform schools.
And if I just could, on September 10th, we will be issuing a report out of Georgetown, which will document how many places around the country there are where there are children buried in old cemeteries or burial sites. So that'll be coming out of Georgetown on September 10th. I'll send you the information so that you can link to it. There'll be a national conference at Georgetown on the 10th, which will include many family members and others working on these issues. It won't be streamed, unfortunately. But I'll send you the information. And when we release that report, we'll be looking to hear and to talk with people in other states, because it'll be the first time that there's a report issued that shows more than half the states that have children who died or were killed in these facilities and were buried. And so our hope is that we can start to expand. The folks in Missouri who you have here are trailblazers, because they're the first to really follow up on this. I'll also ask for people who are willing to pay genealogists to do this work. If anybody wants to fund that work, I think that's very important as well. Volunteers are great, but these are also professionals who ideally are compensated for their work.
Thank you for that. John, I think we need to wrap it up.
As usual, I just learned so much. And sometimes you make these connections that have nothing to do with genealogy, and sometimes you find out they do in ways that you just don't anticipate. So it's always very enjoyable. So thank all of you for taking time out of your day to chat with us, and especially to give our listeners something of value. You good, Kathleen?
Thank you for having us. Thanks to Rebba and Daniel for doing the work, and Kathleen for you doing this. And I just glanced over, and I'm pleased to say, during this call, I got an email from our genealogist who just introduced me to another living family member.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations. You made it to the end of another episode. Thanks so much for staying. Thanks to Mark Schindler, Rebba Omer, and Daniel Feldman for taking the time to tell us about the important work of the Forgotten Children Initiative. Thanks to Chewy Chewbacca Brand for his unwavering lack of interest in anything we're doing. Thanks to new listeners in Botswana, Lebanon, and Pakistan. And of course, thanks to you for tuning in, downloading, and subscribing. The theme song for Hittin the Bricks was written and performed by Tony Fistknuckle and the Draft Sax. Watch for the next appearance in a venal near you. Do you have a genealogical question for Kathleen? Drop us a line at hittinthebricks@gmail.com and let us know.